Imagine David at 71. He walks the dog every morning, drives himself to the store, carries groceries inside, and rarely thinks about whether he is strong enough for ordinary life. Then a respiratory infection keeps him mostly on the couch for a little over a week. The fever passes, the cough settles, and technically he is better. But something feels different. The stairs require the handrail. The grocery bag gets switched from one hand to two. After a shower, he wants to sit down for a few minutes before getting dressed. And David says something older adults say all the time after an illness. I feel like I aged 5 years in 2 weeks. The strange part is that 2 weeks did not create 5 years of aging. What changed was the margin between what David could do and what ordinary life demanded from him. That margin is the idea I want to call reserve. And the most important point in this entire video is simple. What looks like sudden decline is often a threshold being crossed after reserve has been shrinking quietly for years. A minor illness, a short hospital stay, a fall, a period of poor sleep, or even 10 unusually inactive days can reveal a weakness that daily life was still hiding. That does not mean every sudden change is normal aging, and it does not mean you should explain new weakness away as deconditioning. A truly sudden loss of strength, new confusion, one-sided weakness, fainting, chest pain, or severe shortness of breath deserves medical evaluation, sometimes urgently. But when the dangerous causes are ruled out, there's a powerful reason why a person can look healthy on Monday and feel dramatically older a few weeks later. The stressor may be sudden. The loss of reserve usually is not. Think about a staircase you have climbed for 20 years. The staircase has not changed, but the percentage of your available strength and breathing capacity required to climb it can change enormously. When you have a large reserve, the stairs use only a comfortable slice of what you can produce. You do not think about the rail, your breathing, your knees, or where your feet land. The task is cheap. As reserve gets smaller, the same staircase begins to cost more. You pull harder with the legs. Your breathing rises sooner. Balance corrections need more attention. Recovery takes longer at the top. Nothing dramatic has happened yet because you can still complete the task. That is why reserve can disappear without announcing itself. You often notice the loss only when the task begins consuming so much of your maximum that there is almost no spare room left. Then one small stressor removes another piece of capacity, and suddenly the task crosses from easy to difficult. The staircase looks like the problem. The real problem is the shrinking margin behind it. This is also why two people who are both 72 can respond very differently to the same week of illness. One begins with enough spare strength, aerobic fitness, balance, appetite, and recovery capacity that the illness takes a bite out of the reserve and still leaves plenty behind. The other begins much closer to the edge. The same week removes a similar amount of function, but now ordinary tasks are sitting right at the limit. One person says, "That was a rough week." The other says, "I never got back to myself." If this first principle's way of looking at aging is useful, subscribe to Feynman's Body Code, and in the comments tell me which ordinary task first made you notice a change in your own reserve. Stairs, getting up from a chair, walking distance, carrying things, or recovery after a busy day. Now we need to be precise about what reserve actually means, because it is not one tank hidden somewhere in the body. There is no blood test labeled reserve. There is no single organ that stores it. It is a useful way to describe the spare physical and physiological capacity you can draw on when life suddenly demands more than usual. Your muscles have reserve. Your heart and lungs have reserve. Your balance and reaction systems have reserve. Your kidneys and other organs have functional reserve. Your brain has reserve for attention, decision-making, and adapting when several things happen at once. And healthy aging is strongly connected to preserving enough of those capacities that ordinary life remains well below the ceiling. The World Health Organization uses a related idea called intrinsic capacity, the combined physical and mental capacities a person can draw on to function. The language is different, but the practical question is almost identical. How much ability do you have available compared with how much your life asks you to use? That ratio matters more than age by itself, and this is why healthy on paper is not the same thing as having a large reserve. A person can have no major new diagnosis and still have very little spare strength, endurance, balance, or recovery capacity above what ordinary life already requires. The medical chart can look stable while the functional margin is getting smaller. An 80-year-old with strong legs, good walking endurance, stable balance, controlled health conditions, and an active life can have more usable capacity than a sedentary 65-year-old with several poorly controlled problems. There is no typical older person. The calendar tells you how long you have been alive. It does not tell you how close daily life is to your current limit. So why does this margin tend to get smaller without being noticed? Because the body is economical. It maintains expensive capacity when life repeatedly proves that capacity is needed. If the legs regularly have to create force, the nervous system and muscle receive a reason to preserve force. If the heart and lungs regularly have to support brisk movement, the cardiovascular system receives a reason to preserve that performance. If balance is challenged safely, the nervous system keeps practicing corrections. If daily life becomes increasingly easy, seated, supported, and predictable, the body can slowly adapt downward without producing one dramatic symptom. This does not happen because the body is lazy. It happens because biology is responsive. A capability that is never requested becomes easier to lose. That is one reason retirement can be a hidden turning point for some people. The job disappears, but so do the stairs at work, the walk from the parking lot, the carrying, the standing, the schedule, and hundreds of small physical demands that never felt like exercise. Nothing hurts. Nothing seems wrong. But the weekly dose of challenge can fall sharply. The person may still take a 20-minute walk and reasonably believe they are active. What disappeared was not only exercise. It was variety, loading, transitions, and volume spread across the entire day. This is where one small study in healthy older adults becomes surprisingly useful. Researchers took 10 adults around 72 years old and cut their usual step count by roughly 3/4 for 2 weeks, down to around 1,400 steps a day. That is not permanent bed rest. It is closer to what can happen during a bad illness, an injury, a winter indoors, or a period when someone simply stops going out. After only 14 days, the researchers measured a small but real loss of leg fat-free mass. They also found worse insulin sensitivity and a weaker muscle protein building response after food. The study was tiny, so those exact percentages are not a prediction for you. But the direction matters. A short period of much lower activity can change more than fitness. It can change the signals that tell older muscle and metabolism how much capacity to maintain. And complete bed rest can be even more dramatic. In another controlled study, healthy older adults spent 10 days on bed rest. Afterward, knee extensor strength was down by about 13%, stair climbing power by about 14%, and maximal aerobic capacity by about 12%. 10 days. Again, those numbers should not be treated like a timer counting down in every older adult. Different people respond differently, and real illness is more complicated than a research bed. But it destroys one dangerous assumption. Rest is not neutral for an older body. Sometimes rest is medically necessary. But from the point of view of muscle, circulation, coordination, and aerobic capacity, a week of doing almost nothing is still a powerful biological signal. Now put illness on top of that inactivity. A real illness does not simply make a person move less. It can raise the body's energy demands while appetite falls. Sleep can become fragmented. Protein and total food intake can drop. Pain or breathlessness can make movement feel unpleasant. Medications, dehydration, fever, inflammation, or time in the hospital can add more stress. So the body can receive 3 messages at once. Demand is up, fuel may be down, and mechanical use is down. That combination helps explain why the change after an illness can feel far larger than the illness itself. The infection may last 8 days, but during those 8 days the body can lose training signals, nutrition, sleep quality, movement volume, and confidence at the same time. This is one reason clinicians worry about hospital-associated disability in older adults. The person may enter the hospital because of pneumonia, an infection, surgery, or another acute problem. But part of the functional loss around hospitalization can be related to immobility, poor intake, delirium, disrupted sleep, and the general stress of being sick and confined. Recent reviews continue to identify frailty, poor physical function, immobility, and other stressors as important risk factors for functional decline during hospitalization. The hospital did not create aging. The illness did not create all of the vulnerability. The event exposed how much capacity was available to absorb the shock. And that brings us to the most important picture in this video. Imagine 2 horizontal lines. The upper line is your current capacity. The lower line is the minimum capacity required for independent daily life. As long as the upper line stays comfortably above the lower one, you can lose some capacity and still look completely fine. You can miss exercise for a few weeks. You can sleep badly during a stressful month. You can recover from a virus. The reserve absorbs it. But if years of inactivity, chronic disease, low strength, poor nutrition, repeated illnesses, or simply aging have brought the two lines closer together, the same stressor can push capacity below the independence line. That is the threshold effect. The decline appears sudden because the visible consequence is sudden. The vulnerability was building long before the visible consequence appeared. It is like a bridge that still carries ordinary traffic while its safety margin is shrinking. The day a heavy truck finally causes a problem, the truck gets all the blame. But the real story began earlier. David's respiratory infection is the truck. His reserve is the bridge. And this is where the story becomes more hopeful. Because reserve is not only something you lose, parts of it can be rebuilt. Before we get there, though, there is one trap that makes recovery much harder. The trap is the deconditioning loop. David gets over the infection, but stairs feel harder. Because stairs feel harder, he uses them less because he uses them less. His legs receive less challenge. His walking becomes shorter because he tires sooner, because he walks less. His aerobic capacity gets less stimulus. The grocery bags feel heavier, so he carries fewer things at once. The chair feels lower, so he pushes harder with his arms. None of these choices are irrational. They are exactly what a person does when the body feels less capable. But each sensible accommodation quietly reduces the amount of work the body has to perform. That means the adaptation can continue in the wrong direction after the original illness is already gone. Harder task leads to less activity. Less activity leads to less capacity. Less capacity makes the task even harder. That is the loop. And there's a psychological layer too, especially after a fall or a frightening episode of weakness. A person who no longer trusts the legs may move more cautiously. Caution can be useful, but if caution becomes avoidance, the nervous system gets fewer chances to practice balance, force, and confident movement. The body does not know that you are avoiding stairs because you're being careful. It only receives fewer stair-climbing signals. This helps explain why the goal after an illness is not simply to wait until you feel completely normal before moving again. The right amount and type of activity depend on the illness, the person's medical conditions, and what a clinician has cleared them to do. But once movement is safe, rebuilding function often depends on progressive use, not endless protection. That word progressive matters. Trying to prove you're still 25 by doing one heroic workout can create soreness, fear, or injury and send you straight back to the couch. Parts of reserve are rebuilt through repeated, tolerable challenge, not punishment. And there is one more way to recognize reserve that is easy to miss. Do not look only at performance on a good day. Look at the bounce back after a bad one. Two people may walk the same distance on Monday and appear equally capable. Then both have a terrible night of sleep, an exhausting trip, a minor infection, or an unusually demanding weekend. By Wednesday, one is close to baseline again. The other is still moving slowly, skipping errands and rationing energy. That difference is part of what researchers mean when they talk about physical resilience. The ability to resist or recover from functional decline after a health stressor. Reserve describes the margin you have before the hit. Resilience describes part of what happens after the hit. They are related, but they are not exactly the same thing. And this explains another puzzle of aging. Two people can look almost identical during an ordinary week and reveal completely different capacities only when life becomes difficult. So recovery time itself can be useful information. Not a diagnosis, not a score, but a clue about how much buffer the system has and how efficiently it can rebuild after being disturbed. The goal is not panic. It is challenge that the body can recover from and then adapt to. Now there is another reason some declines look mysterious. We tend to track disease better than we track function. A person knows the blood pressure number, they know the cholesterol result, they know the A1C, they may know every medication dose. But they do not know that the same walk has become 6 minutes shorter over 2 years. They do not notice that they started using both hands to rise from the deep sofa. They do not remember that one grocery trip has quietly become 2. They do not notice that a busy Saturday now requires most of Sunday to recover. Those changes are not diagnoses, They do not prove frailty. They are simply clues that ordinary life may be consuming a larger share of available capacity than it used to. I would watch 4 kinds of ordinary change. First, transitions. Getting up from a chair, getting off the floor, stepping into a bathtub, getting in and out of a car. Second, load. Groceries, laundry, a suitcase, a grandchild, a watering can. Anything you used to carry without planning around it. Third, distance and pace. Not whether you can walk, but whether your normal route is becoming shorter, slower, or more interrupted. And fourth, recovery. How long does it take to feel normal after a demanding day, a trip, poor sleep, a minor illness, or an unusual amount of activity? Again, there is no magic cutoff in those observations. The value is the trend. If the same task keeps costing more, something in the system deserves attention. Sometimes the answer is simple deconditioning. Sometimes it is pain. Sometimes it is anemia, heart or lung disease, medication effects, sleep apnea, depression, neurologic disease, arthritis, vision changes, or another treatable problem. That is why unexplained or progressive decline belongs in a real medical conversation rather than being labeled normal aging by default. But if no major new disease explains the change, function itself becomes one of the most useful signals you can track. The question is not, do I feel old today? The question is, how much of my capacity does normal life seem to require now compared with 6 months ago? That is a much more useful question because it gives you something to build. So how do you build reserve without turning life into a full-time rehabilitation program? Start with one of the capacities that protects many others. Strength. Strong legs make stairs cheaper. Strong hips make getting up easier. Stronger pulling and carrying ability make groceries, luggage, yard work, and balance corrections less expensive. Strength also gives the nervous system more force to coordinate when something unexpected happens. That does not mean everyone needs a barbell. Machines, dumbbells, resistance bands, body weight, sit-to-stand variations, step-ups, and carefully progressed home exercises can all create a useful strength signal. For older adults who can do it safely, public health guidelines recommend muscle strengthening activity at least 2 days each week. The goal is not to chase soreness. The goal is to keep asking the body to produce enough force that it has a reason to maintain force. Then protect aerobic reserve. Walking is the simplest entry point for many people. But the important word is intensity relative to you. A slow stroll may be recovery for one person, and a meaningful aerobic challenge for another. Guidelines for adults 65 and older generally aim for at least 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity each week, when health and ability allow, plus strength and balance work. If that amount is not possible, the guidance is not to give up. It is to be as active as your abilities and conditions allow. That matters because reserve grows from where you are, not from where a chart says you should already be. Next, protect balance before balance becomes a crisis. Balance is not simply standing on one leg in the kitchen. It is the nervous system continuously predicting where the body is, correcting errors, coordinating vision, inner ear input, sensation from the feet, and enough muscle force to recover when the prediction is wrong. The best balance work is safe enough to repeat, and challenging enough to require correction. For some people that can be Tai Chi, structured balance exercises, changing walking direction, supported single-leg work, or a physical therapy program. The exact exercise matters less than preserving the ability to correct yourself before the environment has to catch you. Then protect the recovery side of reserve. A body cannot adapt to challenge if challenge keeps arriving without enough sleep, nutrition, or recovery time. This is especially important after an illness, when people sometimes make 2 opposite mistakes. One person stays inactive for far too long because the body still feels fragile. Another tries to make up for lost time in 3 exhausting days. Both can fail for the same reason. The dose does not match the current capacity. A better recovery question is, what amount can I do today that leaves me able to do something useful again tomorrow? That is how training becomes a staircase instead of a cliff. And nutrition matters because rebuilding tissue requires actual material. Older adults recovering from illness may be dealing with reduced appetite at exactly the time muscle needs support. The goal is not to force one universal protein number onto every person. Kidney disease, frailty, swallowing problems, serious illness, and other conditions can change nutrition needs. The useful principle is simpler. If weight is falling unintentionally, appetite is poor, and strength is declining, Nutrition is part of the function problem, not a separate issue to deal with later. This is where David finally changes what he measures. He stops asking only whether the cough is gone. He starts asking whether normal life is getting cheaper again. Can he rise from the same chair without pushing harder with his arms? Can he walk the same dog route without cutting across the block? Can he carry the same grocery bag without switching hands halfway from the car? Can he finish a more active day without losing the next one to exhaustion? Those are not perfect scientific tests, but they are meaningful because they measure the thing David actually wants back. Not a younger birthday. Usable margin. Imagine a second person now. Helen at 76. Helen has not been sick. She simply notices that every winter she moves less, and every spring she returns a little weaker than the year before. Nothing dramatic ever happens. There is no single day when she declines, but the seasonal pattern keeps shaving a small amount from the reserve. This year, she decides to treat winter differently. She keeps 2 simple strength sessions each week. She walks indoors on bad weather days instead of waiting for spring. She practices a few balance drills near a stable support. And she pays attention to whether she is eating enough when appetite is low. By spring, the goal is not to be transformed. The goal is to arrive without having to rebuild from a lower floor again. That is what reserve thinking changes. It moves the focus from dramatic rescue to maintaining margin. And there is an even more useful application when a stressor is predictable. If someone knows surgery is coming, or expects a period of reduced mobility, clinicians sometimes use the idea of prehabilitation, building capacity before the stressor arrives. The logic is simple. If you cannot control the size of the coming stress, one thing you may be able to influence is the size of the reserve that meets it. That can include strength, aerobic conditioning, nutrition, and management of medical problems, tailored to the person and the procedure. It is the opposite of waiting until function is lost and then asking rehabilitation to rebuild everything afterward. You are trying to enter the event with more margin. This is also why a completely disease-free life is not required for healthy aging. A person can have arthritis, treated hypertension, hearing loss, or other chronic conditions and still preserve a surprising amount of functional ability when those conditions are managed and the surrounding capacities stay strong. The World Health Organization makes this point explicitly. Healthy aging is about maintaining the ability to do what matters, not simply collecting 0 diagnoses. That is a much more realistic target. It also explains why chronological age is such a weak description of what a body can do. 2 people can have the same diagnoses and very different reserve. 2 people can have the same reserve and live in very different environments. A person with strong legs may function independently in a 1-story home and struggle in a 3rd-floor apartment with no elevator. A person with mild balance problems may be safe in a well-lit, uncluttered home and vulnerable on dark, uneven stairs. Function is always the interaction between the person and the demand. That means building reserve is only half the strategy. Sometimes the smart move is reducing unnecessary demand. Better lighting does not make the nervous system younger, but it gives the nervous system better information. A handrail does not make the legs stronger, but it provides another option when balance is challenged. Good shoes do not rebuild muscle, but they can make the interface with the ground more predictable. Hearing aids, glasses, medication reviews, and home modifications can all change the amount of reserve required to get through the same day. There is nothing weak about using the environment intelligently. The mistake is using the environment to replace every challenge until the body no longer receives a reason to maintain capacity. Use support to stay active, not to eliminate activity. That distinction matters. Now let us return to the phrase sudden decline. Sometimes the decline really is sudden because a new disease, stroke, heart problem, infection, injury, or medication effect has changed the system quickly. That is why abrupt change deserves respect. But sometimes the event is simply the moment the hidden margin becomes visible. David's infection did not manufacture all of his weakness. It revealed how close ordinary life had already moved toward his ceiling. And once he understands that, recovery stops being a vague attempt to feel young again. He has a clearer target. Rebuild the margin. Give muscle a reason to stay. Give the heart and lungs a reason to keep capacity. Give balance a reason to keep practicing corrections. Give recovery enough food, sleep, and time to support adaptation. And manage the medical problems that quietly consume reserve in the background. You do not need to measure every system every day. You need a few stable reference points in real life. The same chair, the same stairs. The same walking route, the same grocery load, the same kind of busy day. If those tasks stay comfortably below your limit, you have room for life to surprise you. If they keep creeping closer to your maximum, do not wait for the next illness to tell you the reserve is shrinking. Investigate what is changing and rebuild what can be rebuilt. That is the part of aging people often miss. Independence is not a switch that is either on or off. It is supported by a margin. And for years, that margin can shrink while independence still looks completely intact. The goal after 60 is not to prove that you can still survive ordinary tasks. It is to keep enough extra capacity that ordinary tasks remain ordinary. Enough strength that a staircase is not a test. Enough endurance that a grocery trip does not consume the afternoon. Enough balance that a small mistake does not automatically become a fall. Enough recovery capacity that a bad week remains a bad week instead of becoming a new baseline. That is what reserve buys you. Not immortality. Not protection from every illness. Room to absorb the shock and still find your way back. The stressor may arrive suddenly. The reserve usually disappears quietly. And the earlier you protect the margin, the less likely ordinary life is to be the place where you first discover it is gone.